Hello, everybody. Great to see such a wonderfully big, energized crowd here on Wednesday afternoon. Welcome to the presidential address. I'm Abby Fagan. I'm the president of the Society for Prevention Research. And one thing that I really love about the presidential address is that instead of giving it myself, I get to invite somebody to speak to all of us about issues related to prevention science and the conference theme, which is social justice this year, as you all know. Selfishly, I guess, or maybe I should just disclose that I am a sociologist whose research is in criminology. So I really enjoy studying issues related to crime and justice. And for the presidential address this year, I thought it would be wonderful to have the director of the National Institute of Justice here with us. And fortunately, Dr. Levine agreed to speak to all of us. So I'm thrilled to have her here and to speak to us about her priorities at NIJ and the research that NIJ is funding. I won't go into a full-blown bio of Dr. Levine, but I will give a few comments about her background in a moment. But I also want to mention that this is an hour-long session. I think we'll have plenty of time for questions and answers. And I want to remind you and invite you to have questions ready for Dr. Levine. You can ask questions in a variety of ways. There are people who are joining us on Zoom, and if you are attending virtually, you can put questions in the chat box. We're monitoring that, and we'll have someone ask your question for you if you use that feature. You can also ask questions on Twitter. On our conference app, you do have to create, I think, a user profile to do that. And then the most traditional way is you can actually get up and ask a question here in person at the microphone. So we'll do the Q&A after Dr. Levine's remarks. So please keep that in mind. I do want to mention, by way of introduction, that Dr. Nancy Levine was appointed by President Biden as the director of the National Institute of Justice on March 28th, 2022. So it's been a little over a year since she's been in that role. For those of you who may not be as familiar with NIJ, it's the research and technology arm of the U.S. Department of Justice. Dr. Levine does have a PhD in, let me get this right, criminal justice from Rutgers University. She has a long history of working in the field, and before NIJ, she's been in a variety of positions. I will mention one of them. She served as vice president of the Urban Institute, which is here in DC. Some of you may be familiar with it, a nonprofit social policy research organization, where she directed the Urban's Policy Center. So I will leave it at that, except to again say I'm thrilled to have Dr. Levine speak to us, and let's give her a round of applause to get her started.
Thank you, Abby. Thank you, everyone. Always experimenting with different heights here when it comes to mics. How's everyone doing? Welcome to the conference. Are you excited to be here? When's the last time you had this? 3 years ago, 2?
We had it last year in Seattle. Last time in DC was 2018.
2018 was the last time you were all in DC. Well, welcome to Washington. I call it home. Really glad to be here. Abby was so generous in saying how generous I was to spend my time here. But in fact, I'm on your mailing list. And when I saw your very first announcement about the conference and the focus on issues of social justice and equity, I'm like, oh, I want to be there. So this worked out really well for me. Thank you so much. So I wanted to spend some time telling you a little bit about the National Institute of Justice, a little bit about my career trajectory, so you know who I am and who I'm not, and really focus in on 5 key priorities that I've put forth as NIJ director that are priorities for NIJ and its research investments and its grantees, but really I view them as priorities for the field that should span well beyond sociology or criminology to everyone, including folks like you. And then we're going to leave lots of time for Q&A. So don't be shy. If you have questions, bring them forward through all the different avenues that Abby shared with you. So I also want to share that there are so many seats up front. So if you're just entering, and because I'm someone who responds to faces and nods, you know how that works, where you're, yes, thank you, thank you. But if I can't see your faces, I don't get that kind of feedback. And I don't know if I'm boring you to tears or not. So no pressure, but plenty of seats up front. Okay. So about the National Institute of Justice, we are, as Abby said, the research, development, and technology arm of the U.S. Department of Justice. We are one of two key DOJ science agencies, the other being the Bureau of Justice Statistics. What that means in practice is that we are a grant-making entity. Most of our investments are in the form of grants to researchers in academic environments or research institutes. We cover a wide array of topics. One of the joys of being in this role is learning new stuff. Right? Like I knew what I knew, but I didn't know things around forensic science and investigative sciences and all manner of criminal justice technologies. We have a whole side of the shop that does all that stuff. And then we have the social science side that I know pretty well. And that covers a lot of different domains from, more traditional criminal justice systems, policing, courts, corrections, to issues around victimization, the behavioral health disorders and the nexus with the justice system. Oh gosh, I mean, so many different topics. And it really is, I feel like a kid in a candy shop because I get to learn new stuff all the time and also get to see some really fantastic research proposals come into NIJ. And of course, those are peer reviewed and thoroughly vetted. And then we have to make the tough decision about what to invest in. There's so much good work to be done in this space, including in the area around violence prevention. And a big focus of us right now is community-based violence intervention. So, I know I'm speaking to people who embrace a public health approach, right? And that's something that historically in its early days, NIJ was really more law and order-ish, right? Very much CJ system focused, and we have evolved and recognized the value of prevention research and a focus on more of a public health model. So that's something we've been focused on increasingly, and I expect we'll be doing more so in the future. So that's NIJ. About me, I started in the post about a year ago. It took a while from being appointed to starting background checks. It was clean. It was. Before starting at NIJ, I had done a couple different things. I'd been in the field for a while, most prominently at the Urban Institute, heading up the Justice Policy Center there, but being able to engage in my own research at the same time. So it was a fantastic job of both kind of setting some direction for the center, but also still being able to engage in my own research. One of the key projects that I worked on back then was called Returning Home. And it was a longitudinal study of the process of people leaving prison and returning home to their communities, looking at both their risks and needs, but also their strengths and assets, which is something that people hadn't really explored much at that time. And I still think we need to do more to focus on strengths and assets in the research that we do. The other thing about me and my history that Abby didn't mention is that I'm no stranger to NIJ. Not only was I a grantee many times over during my tenure at the Urban Institute, but I worked at NIJ. It was actually my first job when I had finished my doctoral studies, but was ABD, so working on that dissertation. And I got hired at NIJ to be a social science analyst, and I spent 6 years there. So it's been a real joy to return home and to really know the agency so well. Some things change, some stay the same, for better or worse. But it's been a really good institutional home for me, and one I hope that you get to know better if you're not familiar with us, because we really want to expand the pool of partners and researchers that we team up with. So you know that I'm trained as a criminologist. And I'm new to the prevention science community, but I've long been a supporter of focusing on prevention. I've never been interested in the kind of people-focused justice topics that are around figuring out why people do bad things or what works to correct their behavior. It's just not my, I don't know, it's not my personal philosophy. So, prevention science is something that really appeals to me. And I have been thinking a lot about the priorities that I want to put forth as NIJ director, and a lot of that comes from my own personal journey, right? So I want to talk to you about 5 key priorities. And the first and the biggest one is what I'm calling inclusive research. Now, I don't think I invented that term. In fact, I'm pretty sure it was first coined in the disability space many years ago. But it's a catch-all to describe a lot of different components that I think are really important as we engage in research at any time, but particularly in this moment when we're thinking about issues of social justice and racial justice. And, we need to do better. So I didn't come to this the moment I was appointed NIJ director. Oh, I'm a director now. What will I do? Oh, I'll do something like inclusive research. No, this is really much more of a personal journey for me. And one that, I just need to recognize started with very traditional training that I don't believe is particularly inclusive. Now I went to Rutgers Newark School of Criminal Justice, fantastic program, love it. I'm a supportive alum. It was good training, but bear in mind, and I know this is aging myself, but this was about 3 decades ago, although I'm not sure how much has changed, but it was a time when the culture was one where there's a hierarchy of relevant research that started with hard science on the top and social science on the bottom. And within that social science category, the more quantitative disciplines were at the top of that hierarchy, and the more qualitative were at the bottom. It was a culture where qualitative researchers were disregarded and even disparaged. It was a culture that didn't respect the difference between research on communities and research with communities. And it was a culture that signaled that research with communities was kind of, substandard or lacking in rigor. And it was also a culture that frowned upon research interaction with evaluation subjects. I'm using that term intentionally. So it would argue that if you're an evaluator, you have to keep an arm's length from the subject of your evaluation so you can be objective. I understand the firewall issue, and we still look at that carefully when we're looking at proposals at NIJ, but this is a little bit different. This is like, no, you cannot have anything to do with the program you're evaluating. And that, that was the way it was. And that is the way it still is in many departments, in many universities, and many research institutes. And I'm not saying I subscribe to that culture, but I am saying that I had to learn on the job. And thankfully, I spent almost 2 decades at the Urban Institute, and I learned a lot from my more seasoned colleagues about, what makes for the type of research that I think is truly valid and truly relevant, and yes, truly inclusive. And I learned it the hard way. I didn't start out knowing everything I needed to know. And I did come in with more of a quantitative bent. And what I learned from my colleagues is the value and power of mixed methods, right? Not just triangulation, but, combining the quantitative with the qualitative, or what I like to call numbers plus narratives. And I also learned the value of action research, which is quite relevant if you're engaged in evaluation work, and particularly program evaluation, with that all important feedback loop. So it enables and allows and even encourages the evaluators to feedback information on program implementation and operation fidelity as you're evaluating. And I think that's very valid, and it creates for a more authentic relationship and partnership, so that you're not coming back 3 years later and saying, oh yeah, by the way, your program didn't work. And oh, I knew why all along. That doesn't really make for a good research partnership. And, I think we may really undervalue the importance of relationships in the work that we do. We talk about relationships with each other as research teams. but the relationship with the folks that are on the ground, right, are really critical to better recognizing whether we're doing a good job of capturing their experiences as researchers, but also being inclusive in ways that can encourage us to understand better the implications of our findings. So just bringing me to the present day, another thing that I was learning during my own experience as a researcher, I was always sensitive about how in some contexts I was working in communities that were already pretty heavily researched, often communities of color. And I'm going to be the first to confess, like I was just like the next clueless white person doing work in this space, and that I'm like, oh, we need to make sure that, you know, we have a diverse research team. And oh, we have one because we have people who identify with different races and ethnicities, as if that's enough, right? It's not box checking, but it's not understanding that just because someone looks like someone who's in a community that is a part of a research study means that they have the same experiences. It's not good enough. It's better than not, but it's not good enough. I mean, I would even argue that, you know, assuming that just because someone's enrolled in an HBCU, that, you know, they have the cultural competency to work in a certain space. We just don't know that, and we shouldn't assume that. And that's part of why I'm so passionate about inclusive research, and which I would define as research that is intentional about when and how we engage with the people who are closest to the issue or problem under study, whatever that topic of inquiry may be. Now, you know, in the traditional criminal justice context, that could be research that includes making sure that we're engaging with probation officers. But if it's a study about probation practices, you'd also want to learn from the people who are on probation. So it's really thinking about all those critical stakeholders, each one of whom really has expertise that we need to learn from and honor, right? So inclusive research has several different components. One is that type of authentic engagement and involvement. Another is compensating people for their time and their expertise. A third is ensuring that we're translating and ground truthing the findings through engagement with the people who are closest to the issue or problem. And a fourth is to democratize the data, the information that comes out of the research that we produce. And finally, and this will sound marginal, but I'm going to tell a story where I think you'll know it is impactful. Respecting the people closest to the problem by making sure that we are not using stigmatizing language to describe them. Okay, so I'm going to talk about each of these just for a bit. And the first one is on this notion of authentic engagement. And you probably, how many people have heard of community-based participatory research? Most of you, right? So I'm supportive. I think that's great. I'd like to see NIJ fund more of it. We do have some CPPR projects already as grant awards. That's one end of the continuum, but I don't want to let everyone else off the hook if they're not doing community-based participatory research. I think that no matter where you are on this continuum from solely qualitative to mostly quantitative, you can still be inclusive in different ways. And you know, that is bringing findings back to people to help understand them, right? It's engaging them. We often pilot surveys, but how often do we really like talk to people about what the question should be, talk to them about whether we're using the right language and what are we missing by not doing that. So one story I'd like to share is that Dr. Henrika McCoy, who is an NIJ grantee, was given an award to study Black male experiences with violence in both urban and rural communities. And this was a project that would involve interviews and engagement with Black men in these selected communities to really understand how they're experiencing violence, what it might make them engage in violence themselves, et cetera. A really comprehensive, in-depth study. And Dr. McCoy, being trained as a social work researcher, was already very intentional about being inclusive. And so she ensured that she had Black men on the research team. She was very careful about how she engaged with folks in the community and in her practice. But along the way, she learned that there were Black women in the community that wanted to be a part of the study. They wanted to weigh in. Being a Black woman herself, she was like, wow, I just missed that. I was so focused on representing the Black men that I didn't even think about representing Black women. And yet they too have a story to tell. So she reached out to NIJ. Can we adapt the research design to include a component that hears from Black women in the community? And not surprisingly, they learned different things that really added a rich narrative to the research she was conducting. Another issue of inclusive research is ensuring that we're compensating people for their time and their expertise. Now we know that our institutional review boards require compensation for research subjects, right? And that's a little dicey, like you want to give enough that it honors their time, but not so much they feel like they have to do the study because the compensation is too good. And there's a process for that. And it's imperfect, but it's, it exists for the right reason. But there's a lot of different ways that we engage as researchers where it's not necessarily the IRB that's weighing in on these things, right? So it's like, oh, we'll have a focus group. They're already part of this community thing, or, like it's just talking to people because they're already engaged in community work, but not honoring that you're still extracting from them, and that you need to honor their expertise by compensating, thinking really carefully about issues like it's not just a hot meal, it should be some kind of monetary compensation, maybe it's providing childcare, thinking about the time of day when you do these convenings, a lot of ways to be more intentional. And an example I'll lift up on that is the Restoring Promise initiative that it was a grant award to the Vera Institute of Justice. Restoring Promise is it's a way of re-envisioning the experience of incarceration for young men. And it's not a model, but it's kind of a process whereby the young incarcerated men and the correctional officers assigned to this new way of doing things in this unit come together and make their own rules about how they want to operate that are really grounded in a restorative justice kind of model. And so I think they have 5 active sites and 2 more on the way. And so this was an evaluation of that program in 2 sites. And they not only were being mindful of compensating people for their work while they were doing it, but they actually trained incarcerated men in the research process, hired some of them after their release from prison, and 2 of them are now full-time members of their research team. Now, that's a great example of being inclusive and going beyond the compensation that's just a one and done, but compensation in terms of really building capacity that can enable people to have new tools, something to put on a resume, some way to be marketable, and really adding value both to the individual and to the communities where they reside. Another example of inclusive research has to do with translating the research findings and ground truthing them with the people that helped generated them. So a few years back when I was still at the Urban Institute, my colleagues and I teamed up with the Austin Justice Coalition in Austin, Texas. We were really interested in working with them to better represent the perceptions and experiences of people who reside in heavily policed high crime communities, which we believed were really underrepresented in traditional research. It was the kind of project that really demanded more of a community-based participatory approach. So we partnered with them together. We co-developed a survey that also had law enforcement contributing to the survey because we wanted to say, what kind of questions should we ask of the community to know how you're doing? And we wanted their buy-in. So when the findings came out, they wouldn't, they'd be like, yeah, I had a hand in this. This must be true, right? So when we had time, we got the findings back and kind of analyzed them mostly in Washington at the Urban Institute. So not full on participatory. We could have done better with that. Brought the findings back to the Austin Justice Coalition and their partners in the community. And one of the findings was, it was a question that was stated something like, do you want more, less, or about the same amount of policing in your community as you have now? And I think 2/3 said they wanted the same amount or more. And our advocates and some of the folks that we actually recruited from the community and trained and compensated to do the interviews were like, that can't be true. Nobody wants more police. That's wrong. And I'm like, it's not. Like, we triple checked the analysis. The numbers are right. And then they said, well, can you look at it by age? And like, why I didn't think of this? It's just a great example of how, I have a certain lens and a certain way of looking at the world. So we looked at the responses by 40 and over and under 40. And guess what? 40 and over wanted more policing or about the same. People under 40 wanted less policing, right? So we wouldn't have been able to extract out those nuances had we not been partnered with folks who were really on the ground, who asked that question. We also did something pretty interesting. We did what's called a data walk because we were mindful that even if we did a great job in presenting the findings in a way that was like plain language, accessible, simple graphs, it's still like, it's not accessible to the average person. And so we did something different where we convened in a community center. We had different stations with findings that were kind of thematic in nature. And we were each stationed at the table where we did have some simple graphs, but we also just talked to them and explained, like, this is what this is showing. And then we asked them to use Post-it notes to, like, I think there was yellow for just kind of how they felt about that finding, and then green for what recommendations do they have coming from that finding. And then we collected all of that. We brought it back before the police department, and they implemented every single, no, they didn't. No. They didn't implement anything we suggested. They said, oh yeah, we're already doing that. We're already doing that. We're already doing that. I mean, they might have been a year ago or in a pilot or who knows. But another thing that we learned from this study was the power of using the data generated from these processes to democratize it and give it back to the community in ways that they can use it to advocate for what they want, right? So even though the police department was not really gung-ho about taking the recommendations, right around the same time, there was a negotiation around a renewal of the police union contract. Now, y'all aren't really policing people by and large, I'm guessing, but there's a lot that's embedded in these contracts that is huge leverage for reform or not, right? Things like mandated 40 hours of firearms training, right? And yet no hours of crisis intervention training. A lot around issues even of officer wellness that could be more robust, and because we know that wellness affects everyone, right? And so at this time, the Austin Justice Coalition was lobbying heavily the city council to vote against this contract, to start anew, to kick it back and to negotiate more of those kind of reform measures into it. And there was one holdout, and she happened to represent the exact community where we did this research. So they came in and they presented those findings, and guess what? She decided to vote against that existing contract, sent them back, and they were able to use that as leverage to get a better contract that would better serve the community needs. So there really are ways that we as researchers can promote social justice if we are indeed inclusive. The final aspect of inclusive research that I wanted to touch upon is this notion of people first language. Have you all heard about people first language? Know what I'm talking about? You probably invented it, right? It's really important. Language matters. It matters so much. And you know, in the justice context, it's often talking about people who are convicts or criminals or offenders, and that is not inclusive and it's not respectful. And we never ever want to label someone based on the worst day of their lives, right? And what's really interesting is we have some good research that suggests it really does make a difference. So Professor Megan Denver, who was a former colleague of mine at the Urban Institute, she's now at Northeastern, she and I started talking about the importance of language years ago. And there's a report that we had and she did the first draft and I'm like, what's that O word doing in there? Get that offender word out of there. And then we started talking about it and why it was important. And it stuck with her. So she had an opportunity years later to do an experiment where they presented like A/B scenarios to, I don't know, general population respondents, where the A was using like offender type language and the B was using people first language, and found that when describing people who had committed violent offenses, the stigmatizing language led the respondents to be much more punitive and in their view of those individuals. So we really know that this makes a difference. So I just spent a lot of time talking about inclusive research. And I have a few other priorities, but I am also mindful that I want to hear from all of you. So I'll try not to race ahead, but I did want to make note of a close cousin to inclusive research. And that's what I'm calling approaching our research through a racial equity lens. And not just a racial equity lens, but an equity lens writ large, you know, across all facets of identity. But particularly in my space, when you're involved in anything to do with the justice system, you know, we cannot be blind to the history. We cannot be blind to the embedded biases. And yet traditionally we are. So going back to, you know, how I was trained traditionally, well, you always put a race variable in your regression model because, you know, that explains so much. Oh gosh, how much I've learned over the years. It's like, okay, but what is that really measuring? It's measuring all these things around structural inequality and disadvantage and institutional biases and straight out biases. And yet we're like saying that we're being scientific or using data that is handy, which is great, but also has baked in biases. I mean, if I see another study that looks at recidivism by measuring it through arrest data, you know, I might just, my head's going to explode. It's like arrest data is a measure of where police are and who they choose to arrest. But we keep using these same methods. And, you know, I think in part it's because of the academic environment, the pressure to publish. You know, it's easier to publish when you grab pre-existing data. And it's just not good enough. We need to be better. So we encourage everyone to employ a racial equity lens in their work as a means of both interrogating the data and the methodologies that we employ. Great story that really brings this to life. Another NIJ grantee who's a former sexual assault medical examiner, nurse practitioner, observed the fact that women who were coming in presenting as, you know, victims of intimate partner violence and sexual assault who had very dark skin pigmentation, she was unable to document those injuries. She'd try every which way, brighter lights, this and that. The lights that are used to detect these injuries were developed by and for white people, quite candidly. And so she received an NIJ award to conduct an experiment which is wild. A bunch of women of different skin tones volunteered to be part of this experiment where they were administered bruises. And then those bruises were measured over the course of, I think, 4 weeks, because, you know, the color and shape changes over time. And of course, on different skin tones. And then Dr. Scafidi from GMU experimented with different lights and colored goggles to see what worked best on different skin tones. And what she learned was that a violet light with yellow goggles was 5 times more effective in detecting bruises and injuries on women with very dark skin pigmentation, which is just such a great story to me of both how research can embed biases, but also how science can promote greater equity, right? I have more to say on interdisciplinary research because we tend to be very siloed in all our fields. And whereas NIJ awards grants to people in a lot of different disciplines, we don't see enough of those different disciplines coming together. And I think that that makes for more robust, more rigorous, more powerful, and more inclusive research. So that's a key priority for me as well. And finally, one of the big goals of my tenure at NIJ is to promote what I'm calling evidence to action. And what this means is, like, why are we in this space? Why are we generating knowledge if we don't care about how it's used to promote social justice, to promote equity, to level the playing field? And yet so much of our research just ends up in journal articles or big technical reports, or we strive to translate it to make it more accessible. We still don't know whether the people who could most benefit from it informing changes in policies and practice that do promote greater access to services and better equity even know about them, much less use them. So implementation science is something we really want to invest in to better understand how we can move the field forward so that all of these research projects that, by the way, all of our solicitations for research proposals now embed those priorities I just described into the solicitations, such that if you follow all these priorities, you will have a leg up as a grantee, as an applicant, as a way to really try to move the field forward. And even there, though, once that research is generated, we need to do more to make sure that that goes from evidence to action. And then I just want to close by saying, I'm a year into the job, but it's a political appointment. And so I serve at the pleasure of this president. I don't know how long I'll be in this role. And so every day I wake up and I'm thinking, how can I make a difference? What will be my legacy? And I know from past experience that building things, they get dismantled so quickly. And yes, I can put priorities into research solicitations, and we can seed research that will carry on after I leave to some degree. It's the nature of the beast that a new person comes in and they want to start anew, they want to undo whatever the person who came before them did. And so I'm really interested in investing in people, and in particular, our future scholars, the students, and also in leveling the playing field. So we have a solicitation that is coming out soon that is to invite proposals to be a resource hub for HBCUs and other minority serving institutions to level the playing field for them as grantees, right? So how do you build a pipeline of future PIs? How do you reduce the burden, the administrative burden of even applying for research grants? And then we also support a graduate research fellowship and are doing a lot of other investments in this space. So I feel like I've talked to you for way too long. I really do want to hear from you. So I will close and welcome any questions you have in any format you have them. Thank you.
Borrow your mic for a minute. Yes, so I'm go ahead and invite questions from the audience. If you are here and want to ask a question, we have microphones I can see two in the front. I can't quite tell from the glare if there are any in the back, but feel free to use the microphones. I'll also ask our co-moderators if there are any questions from Zoom or Twitter or the conference app as we're waiting for people to stand up. Karen, are there questions at this point from those other mechanisms? Okay. And I've got questions myself, but I don't want to hog the limelight more than I'm already doing. But as you're formulating your own questions, maybe I will ask my own question. And it really relates to something you just said, Dr. Levine, and it might be, I'm sure it's something you've given a lot of thought to, but what would success look like to you if you, when the time comes when you have to step down as director, what is the one thing you most want to accomplish or that you would feel the most proud of as your legacy?
Well, that's a good one. Again, it's all about people. So I'm working on the culture of NIJ itself because, you know, all those career federal employees stay on, and it's not been a hard transformation at all. I feel like a lot of people were eager for the kind of messaging that I've been delivering to them. But that's really the way to do it, is just ensure that it gets infused in the culture of the Institute, because even if someone new comes along, I can tell you those career employees are really good at like doing what they want to do. So that is one measure of success. I know you all have questions. Thank you.
Can you hear me? Oh, okay. The question that I had was, what do you think it would look like to kind of make knowledge more accessible, so that they're not hoarded, maybe for a certain group of people or hoarded in academic journals? What would it look like to make useful information accessible to more people so that it's common knowledge?
Okay, so let me try to repeat that because it is a little muffled. So what do I see as a strategy to make research findings more accessible?
Yeah, pretty
Okay.
much.
Great question. A couple of things. This is something I experimented with when I was at the Urban Institute, which is a place where, you know, it attracts people who want to produce research to make a difference, right? And so I came up with what I call the pyramid approach, right? So at the very bottom of the period is your technical report. It's really long. It's got every single detail about your methodology, your data, limitations, etc. I don't know who reads that. But you kind of have to do it, right? And then next up is probably your journal article or a series of journal articles. And who reads those? Other academics, maybe, right? Not even your mom. Well, you might say, look, mom, and like, and then the next level up is maybe like the really good tight executive summary that goes with the final report, right? So then now you're getting a little bit more accessible, right? And then maybe you do something unthinkable, like you do an op-ed. I've done many of them. Or I don't know, something that's more in an association publication, you know, something that reaches a broad audience that's really, you know, again, more accessible. And then where do you go from there? Your abstract. And we worked so hard at the Urban Institute to develop abstracts that really said what the findings were. When I first started, it's like, what's wrong with these abstracts? They all say what you're going to do. And it's like this at the end, they still use the abstract that talks about the methods, but not the findings. So an abstract that really, you know, very tightly says, we approach this for this reason. This is what we learned, and these are the implications. And then you go up to the tippy top of the pyramid, and then you're talking about posting on LinkedIn and tweets and, you know, other ways to get things out in the media. And I think you have to really do all of those. And that is a lot of work. But if we don't get to the top of that pyramid, we're not being accessible. I think another thing we can do is be more intentional about partnering with various practitioners. So in the justice world, we have something called lead scholars. Those are law enforcement advancing data and science. And these are mostly sworn officers who, for whatever reason, geek out around data and research and want to find similar people and get trained and go to conferences and do their own research, and we support them. And so when you like translate research like that to the people who are most positioned to actually use research findings, that's like kind of cutting out the middle person right there. Another question?
Hi, thank you for a really thoughtful discussion on inclusive research within the criminal justice space. Your talk really made me think about an experience of a loved one of mine who is a first-generation immigrant that struggles with schizophrenia. And he was incarcerated after a paranoid episode. And so I was wondering how your work incorporates intersectional identities in terms of, promoting more inclusive research.
Yeah. That's a really good point. And that's one thing I really love about NIJ and the space I've been in for so long is that it's not one discipline. And, the justice system is a very sad example of how all of these issues can kind of snowball in any one person or community. So the interdisciplinary research team concept, I think, is a really good way of addressing that, because I think there's a saying, if the only tool you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail to you. If you are so siloed that you're not even thinking around like some other, underlying factors or issues, you're not going to, do good research that's really comprehensive, but also not come up with solutions that are comprehensive and acknowledge that intersectionality. Yeah.
So I guess just in addition to the siloness, are there any plans for NIJ to partner with other federal, entities, whether it's HUD or, all of them, just to be able to address all these different intersectionalities?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. We routinely partner with a whole host of different federal partners on different topics. So HUD, we have a very good relationship with HUD, NIDA, CDC. I don't want to like list them off for fear of missing one, but we absolutely do that. And things happen, right, that force collaboration in, I think, really positive ways. So for example, the president's executive order on accountability and policing has a component around police officer wellness, and I think also around police ability to identify people in crisis in the community. Well, we've done a ton of work on that, but they gave that piece of it to HHS. So we're like, okay, HHS, let's talk. And they're like, oh, it's really helpful. You've done all this research in this space, but they're bringing a different lens, right? Which is an important one. So yeah, those types of partnerships are very important to us. Hey.
Question from Zoom.
Mhm.
What are some other ways agencies, organizations, et cetera, can encourage and support new data while currently the publish or perish drive in academia seems to support the use of old data?
Yeah, boy, whoever you are in Zoom land, great question. I wish I had the answer. I'm so frustrated with the academic environment because the incentives or the reward system, it reinforces that culture I was describing before, right? That very hierarchical, not inclusive culture. And I don't know how to change it. And I deliberately didn't go into the academic environment. I was very strategic. I got my PhD because I thought I had to be taken seriously back a long time ago when I was working in Texas, and just never ended up in the environment because I didn't see the connection to practice. And it's not much change, and I don't know how to change it. I think maybe we change it through being maybe a grant making entity that will give you research dollars to do things differently. And, you know, there are plenty of academic environments that reward that. They like to see people bringing in new research grants. But I really think it's going to be outside of academia that pushes on these innovations and new ways of thinking and doing.
Okay, so we are a bunch of academic wonks, but I'm thinking about the paywalls that interested parties hit when they're trying to get to the academic research. So I'm a journal editor. To what degree do the proposals to NIJ encourage or support open access fees, as well as fees for someone like I can only write a paper in Word. I need to hire someone to make things look pretty and to make them accessible. So could those elements be baked into proposals? So we can pave the way for better access to what we're doing?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I'm sure you're aware the federal government is now, well, this administration is requiring that we really engage on these issues of open access for any of our grantees. It used to be agencies that awarded $100 million or more. We're at like the 70 to 80 $1 million a year mark. But now we are developing our own policies. We have not finished developing them yet. We do have a lot of grantees that already build in those fees into their proposals because they're accustomed to doing that with other funders. And that's certainly allowable. And I think will be more than allowable, probably be encouraged or required. There are some challenges with that because by the time they're at the point of publishing in a journal, the project period has ended. And I don't know how to get around that. And then to answer your other question, we're also, so we built in these priorities I described with the one around evidence to action includes like being more intentional about your dissemination mechanisms and strategies. And so we are also prioritizing proposals that dedicate a significant amount of the budget to dissemination. One that often like gets winnowed away as you get the no cost extensions, you run out of time, but like to really dedicate those dollars to that purpose so that we can make sure that that translation piece happens.
So I'm curious, I've been having conversations about how some of the traditional demographic categories, which are used to discover disparities, are often in themselves not inclusive or confusing to people when they're trying to figure out exactly what box am I. So I'm just curious about how we are, or if there are conversations on how we're reimagining the demographic boxes that we use, because there are just some communities I've been talking to who feel like, well, I don't really know what to check, yet we take the data and what people check to determine resources and allocation to determining what disparities exist in a community. So I'm just curious if we're having conversations about the demographics part of this work.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I know that the various federal agencies are working with census to look at a different way to measure demographics, and there was a request for input from the field. I know it was extended. I think it has closed since, but you might want to just look it up because what they're proposing, I think, and I'm not an expert on how to measure these things, is probably the most inclusive and equitable approach, and one that we should be moving forward with, which is really like letting people self-identify and check more than one box and do all those things that acknowledge, you know, what a diverse, you know, community we are, even even within individuals, right? Like we have a lot of different identities that need to be captured. So I think we're moving in the right direction. The problem is in so many of the questions we're asking, this is the future, and we're looking at data from the past. And the data from the past, I mean, I was just reflecting this morning. I had a moment of shame. I have lots of one time where I did a study where I looked at white, non-white. And it was like, so dumb. I can't believe I even presented that, but that was all I had, you know? Because just the data is so poor when you're getting it from administrative sources. And I don't know how to fix that, nor even when we come up with these better measures, we can't do anything kind of longitudinal because look at the past, and the past has the bad measures. So I don't think there's any easy answers, but we can't give up just because it's not easy.
Thank you.
Another question from Zoom, or more of a comment, I think. It seems like some of your concerns about academia may be driving some of the distrust of academia and education. Seems like your inclusive research approach is an opportunity to build bridges between educators, or those being who focus on teaching at universities, academics, students, and communities that could build trust in education and academia.
Well, that's a great comment. Thank you.
We may have time for one last question. About 2 minutes left. Okay, well, I know you can find Dr. Levine right around the corner. You could track her down while you're here the rest of the week if you need to.
Thank you so much. It's been an honor. Thank you.
Thank you very much.